who are related in many ways culturally, Indians who have not been studied enough, in my opinion. Indians where you could go through school, in an ordinary school, in an ordinary city in the United States and never find much about them. And it's a tragic story. It's a story of racism and bigotry. It's not a story that the United States should be proud of at all. And I want to find out how it's been in Canada, Ken. Can you tell us?
Well, as a generalization, not much better. However, the very, very bleak position that Canada's Native people were in a few years ago has been improving very quickly and very dramatically. For example, one of our medium-sized provinces, Manitoba, that's right north of Minneapolis, um, it just recently elected a native Indian as its premier for the province. But our history was very much like the U.S. We did not do the same level of the little bighorn slaughtering the Indians, much like the U.S. did. However, and we also didn't ship whole tribes to different locations like the U.S. sent many uh, Indians to Oklahoma that were from nowhere near Oklahoma. However, our initial approach to handling natives or dealing with them for all of Canada was one of trying to force them to assimilate. And the key piece of the enforcement was what are called uh, Indian schools, or that they required every Indian child to go to a separate school. Most of them were run by the Catholic Church, and there's fantastic, endless list of horror stories of what arose with these residential schools, as they were called. Well, the point of these schools was to, you know, eliminate any native language usage, and secondly, to try to have all of the kids more assimilated to, the Canadian way of life. It was a terrible failure, really. Um, as late as 1970, we had the then Prime Minister of Canada, the father of our current Prime Minister. Then it was Pierre Trudeau, and he uh, came developed a thesis that we should end all agreements with all natives, and they should just period assimilate, no other choice. And he really pushed hard, but there was such a backlash from the native population that his government actually ended up backing down. But it shows that, only, 40, 50 years ago, there was that same attitude that created these residential schools. Well, and a few years ago, we had a governmental commission or a special study of, and really it was called recreation, or sorry, um, the I lost my train of thought on that. But anyhow, the entire study was how do we do reconciliation with the native population? Well, what we're sitting with now, is day and night different than, 40, 50 years ago. Is that the kids that were forced to go through these residential schools, especially the latter part of them, which was the same time that I was in, junior high school and high school, there was, kids going through these residential schools. Well, as those natives became older and they started to dominate their societies, they really had a almost like a motivation for revenge or motivation to fight back. So that we had, the majority of the leaders in all of the native population in Canada were very, very anti everything that they had been had shoved down their throat in these residential schools. And so this reconciliation with our natives has been very difficult. Now, compared to the US, we have about 5% of our population is native. Now, we break our natives into three categories. We have, you know, what Americans would call a normal Indian, Métis, and thirdly, we have Inuit. Now, the U.S. has Inuit in Alaska, but the Inuit were treated much better in many regards because nobody was there pushing them around. And our history dealing with the natives is atrocious at every turn. We had entered into treaties with the natives and then endlessly broke every treaty that was ever signed. You know, we provided the natives with reservations, but then stood on our head to shrink them or to try to, you know, expropriate things that weren't in there. Well, today, the difference is the natives are called First Nations. And in the city I live in, which is about 250,000 people, about 70,000 of those people live on native land. And we have major shopping centers on the native land, and they get the native band gets revenue similar to the owners of land in Hawaii, where it's like leased land. Under the Federal Indian Act, which governs all Indian reservations, they cannot sell their land, but they can lease it. So
I want to clarify one thing. When you say band, that's the same thing as tribe in the United States, right?
yes, somewhat. What we have these so-called First Nations, and for example, in the area from let's call it Central Washington State, um, north to where I live, there's what was called one Indian nation in many regards back in the old days is broken down into seven different, smaller ones, and really in the Canadian part of that, Columbia River Basin, there the Okanagan River Basin, really, they there's five different First Nations, and they're pretty tiny in the sense of the one that owns all the land right near where I live, including, where, you know, people like Walmart lease land from the natives, and send money to their coffers. Well, that particular um, First Nation or band has less than 1,000 people in it, like less than 1,000 members. Now they have about 5 square miles of land, and most of it is, surrounding one side of the area, the central part of British Columbia that I live in, and and so that band, in theory, would be very wealthy. Well, in fact, it's a little bit like a typical oligarchy, or like the breakdown of income in the United States, as Bernie Sanders would describe it. The very rich are very rich, and the top few hundred billionaires have more money than the bottom 30% of the U.S. population. Well, in a lot of these Indian First Nations, as they became more economically integrated with the rest of Canadian society, the chiefs or the chief's friend or a few of the band members or tribe members, managed to get the rights to deal with the land that's under the Walmart store, or the land where, there's a neighborhood with 10,000 single family homes sitting on it, collecting rent. And so you have some multi millionaire natives in the metropolitan area where I live. And yet, if you go on to the reservation where it's, not being rented to, some, Canadian business or Canadian neighborhood, or commercial store, the poverty level is obviously much greater than the nearby neighborhoods. That is, the social problems still exist, not to the same degree as when I was, a teenager, but for sure, it's a bloody disgrace. Canada has made, the international news, as, you know, not properly treating its indigenous people. Now, it's easy for Germany or Austria or France to say that because they don't have any left. Where they can pick on Australia and Canada and the US and, all the countries in South America. But nevertheless, we do not have a nice history of dealing with our natives. However, I think that, the plight of an American native in the Dakotas is far worse than the plight of the natives, you know, a couple hundred miles north of there in Manitoba, where they just elected a native as the premier of the province. Now, our native population also has, uniqueness in some of their crimes. The treatment of women is very different in the handling in the Canadian natives. The women are like third class citizens in their First Nations in many regards. Now that's gradually changing. We actually have some First Nations where the head of the First Nation is a female for a change. But that is certainly happening much slower than in the rest of Canadian society. Now, how's that compare with what's happening in the U.S.?
Oh, gee whiz, the U.S. is inextricably intertwined with Indians, but we don't know it. We haven't been taught about that in school. Since the 60s, we've been more conscious of it, but we're still not very conscious of it. And it is racist, and it is completely unfair. And there's very little consciousness that brings it to equality. Let me go back in time, though. We always put down the Indians from the very beginning. Remember, the Indians were siding with the British and the French in the French and Indian Wars, and people didn't like that much. And they saw the Indians. The Americans saw the Indians. The Americans were, largely white Christian. They saw the Indians as creatures and savages, and that lasted right through the 18th century and through the 19th century, and even into the 20th century. And yes, just as you say, there were all these treaties. You could list them. There'd be hundreds of them all over the country with gosh, there must have been almost 100 tribes in the U.S. And they got cheated on everything. They were taken advantage of in every way possible. And then, you have the American public raised with Hollywood in the 20th century, casting Indians as violent and brutal and, you know, subhuman for movie after movie after movie. And the white Christian cowboy, he was the hero always. And so I think people carried that kind of racism forward into the 20th century. And even now, we have these caricatures of Indians as less than white Christian Americans. We really got to get over that. Some of your points are equally applicable to the US. We had those residential schools too, and they are famous for abuse and rape. The Catholic Church was involved in them. Horrible, brutal atrocities took place in those schools, and state governments didn't stop it. And it went on for, a good part of the 19th century, the 20th century. So, what is really remarkable is how little the government cared about the human aspects of the Indians' condition. And of course, we had the Trail of Tears. And I want to tell you about the Trail of Tears. It wasn't just Georgia to Oklahoma, it wasn't just the Cherokees. It was a number of tribes, a number of states, all in the South. And the government, through Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren, found ways to do horrible atrocities on them, marching them around under these guides, these enforcers from the military, that they had to travel west to Oklahoma, to the Indian lands, they called it, which is now Oklahoma. And these were undesirable lands. They were junk lands.
Until they
a lot
had
of them,
oil.
well, we'll get to that. They had a lot, of deaths on the way. Now, not all of them moved. Some of them found ways not to move. And there are remnants of tribes in the southern states right now today, the Seminoles, for example, who actually rebelled. But there wasn't all that much rebellion because the Howleys fooled them. The Howleys made these phony treatments with them. Andrew Jackson he thought he was doing a good thing for the country, but he wasn't doing a good thing for the Indians. He thought he was enforcing longstanding policy vis-a-vis the Indians, but he was actually destroying them. And this Trail of Tears, Ken, was genocide, no question about it. Their culture was wrecked, and they were killed, and they were exposed to smallpox, among other things, and they died in huge percentages all over the country. And then, of course, we get to Killers of the Flower Moon, a recent movie, right? And which tells you a story that you did not learn in school, but which is nevertheless absolutely true. These Howley guys married the Indian women who had rights to oil. And they resented the fact that the Indians had rights to oil because the Indians were supposed to go away into the worst lands imaginable back when in the 19th century. Instead, surprise, surprise, they have millions in oil revenue. But the white Christian fellas married them and then killed them. In the movie, it makes it very clear, and separated them and their families from ownership of the land. So they, the white Christian guys, could own the land and the oil. And this was a practice that was, throughout Oklahoma and maybe other states where there was oil. That's what the movie is about. But why the movie is so popular is that it examines this racism, this horrible, brutal, genocidal racism that took place in this country, which we were not told about in school. The other revelation for me is that, remember, we had slavery. We had slavery, in the 18th century, certainly most of the 19th century, and we had, Black racism throughout. And what's interesting is you find examples of the Indians being treated as slaves, just as if they were Black. But in some places, the Indians owned slaves, just as if they were white. Slavery, permeated the whole social experience in the US, and the Indians were really close to that on both sides of the line. The worst side, of course, was the side where they were treated as slaves and treated as blacks. And I didn't know, and I met somebody not too many years ago, which was a revelation for me also, is that on one of the reservations in the United States, there was a fair number of black Indians. I had never met a black Indian. But the fact is that there were black Indians 100 years ago, 150 years ago, living on the reservations that the federal government established. And they were part of that culture. And so you look around and you see, my goodness gracious, they didn't tell us about this in school. They didn't tell us about the relationship of the Indians and the blacks and slavery. We really have to learn more about this country. I agree with you that there are some people who have somehow elevated to public office, and the governor of a province and of a state, members of Congress and the like, but it's a tiny minority. And they do not do well in business for a variety of reasons, including availability of capital and cultural points that come down through the generations. But in fact, they're not doing that well. And if you go on the reservations, you find two things: you find poverty, you find abuse, and that includes abuse with alcohol, abuse with drugs, and just as you say, abuse of women as a cultural point. And so they are resentful, and they carry a certain animosity toward the white Christian crowd that was, in the government, in the many administrations that made waste of them, that broke all those hundreds and hundreds of treaties regularly and had massacres of them. So we look at the movies and we think, oh, the Indians were mean. No, the Indians were innocent. It was the American people, the American government, who were mean and awful, and in some ways who still are when it comes to Indians. I remember at some sort of protest at the beginning of the Trump administration where he dumped on Indian tribes, and they came to Washington to complain about it. But by and large, the Indians have not been successful in court to establish themselves. It was not until the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that they were fully, franchised, voting and as citizens. Up till then, it was kind of spotty, and there were efforts at legislation, but it wasn't complete until the 1960s. And so, you find this lingering thread in the American story that is really hard to accept, hard to understand, and hopefully that will change. But still, I don't think we understand it. I don't think we accept it. I don't think we are educated and informed about it. And that is a burden on the country going forward. Furthermore, one other thing, I think the racism that we have against African Americans, other groups in this country, is connected to the racism we have had, especially in the 19th century, against the Indians. All those tribes, all those people who were brutalized in the Trail of Tears, those experiences made them harder, more resentful, and it made the guys in the Confederacy who owned slaves, it made them worse. And so there's a connection. I'm not sure what it is. I haven't figured it out, but I'm sure that people have written about this. Not the books aren't particularly popular because nobody reads them, but I think there's a connection between the racism that we practiced and learned and how it informed our way of dealing with the African Americans in and after slavery. Is, as I said at the outset, this whole issue with Indian rights is inextricably intertwined, and they have not had the standing or the rights or the franchise they should have had, even at the time of the Constitution.
Well, I think though there's some good news in Canada with regard to the native population, and really, um, to me it comes down to an economics concept. That one of the famous economists in history basically said that the key to to improving the lot of people comes down to trade and jobs and economics. And, in Canada, similar to your example of the Oklahoma natives just happen to be on good oil land. Well, in Canada, an Indian Act does not allow natives to sell land to anybody else. They can rent it or lease it, but if they're leasing it to anybody other than one of their own tribe members, they've got to deal with the federal government's Indian Act and regulations. So it's really hard
Well, that
to get
reflects
them
the
involved.
concern. That reflects the concern of the government that they would be cheated out of their land. Right?
Exactly
That's what it's all about.
exactly the movie example. But in the Okanagan Valley where I live, we have an extremely prosperous uh, band, and they don't sit on any oil. They happen to sit in a fantastic resort area. While really this whole valley is a resort area to a great extent. And this particular First Nation, which is part of the one, like the where I said there's five different First Nations make up the Okanagan Indian Band, but this is one of the five that's in Canada. Well, they own a fancy resort. They own a huge tourist area where they show off all kinds of native things and history of this and that. But they own a golf course, they own a winery, they own major orchards, they own wineries, or let's call it the grape growing as well as the actual conversion into wine. um, and and they have no unemployment in that band or that First Nation. Now it's small; it's like 1,000 people are the band members, but their standard of living is right up to snuff with the average of the area they live in. Wherein the rest of Canada or the Canadian average is the standard of living of the average native in Canada is still between 75 and 80% of the local population near where they live, or the non-native.
Yeah, I understand in the U.S. Some 70% of the identifiable Indians live in cities now, and they have jobs and they're assimilated. Okay, maybe not to the extent that the founding fathers would have anticipated, but or should have anticipated, but they're in the cities. The concern is not necessarily for them, although they may not have the same opportunities that a white Christian would have. Um, the concern is for the ones left behind on the reservations, where there is, ubiquitous poverty on these reservations. And the government really hasn't helped. It doesn't spend a lot of money, neither on the state or the federal level. But as you say, there are bright spots in certain areas for certain groups, certain tribes, which take advantage of their territory and their federal status, because the states, generally speaking, don't run them. The federal government does. They respond to federal law, not necessarily state law. So what you have is 250 plus casinos around the country that are not subject to state regulation, but everybody goes there and they gamble. And I'm not saying it's beautiful like some of the casinos in Las Vegas, but they make money in areas where gambling would not otherwise be permitted. See, and that is great revenue. That is one in Connecticut, notable on the East Coast. And as you say, there are some on the West Coast, not too far from the city of Santa Fe, New Mexico, which has a lot of Indians, Pueblo Indians. They have a huge casino there. So these areas, these opportunities work well, but I'm not sure how many Indians they really serve. I'm not sure how the tribal governance works. That is, whether the whole tribe has a benefit or just a few people have the benefit. And nobody has real control over that, not the state or the federal, as far as I can see. So that if a couple of guys are lining their pockets out of the revenues out of these casinos, what about the fellows back on the reservations who don't necessarily share in that? So I think it's an inequity, and there are people left behind, people living in poverty, and I'm not sure that the federal government is really taking care of them. The other, interesting point, and it's relevant to this whole notion about the government stepping in once in a while and feeling sympathy for the Indians and saying, "We're not going to let you sell your land." Your point. We're not going to let you sell your land because you'll be cheated. Well, that was that was generated out of the fact that thousands of Indians were cheated. That's why those statutes were passed. That's why it was included in treaties that got broken. And so I think it's important to examine the network of laws, the patchwork of laws in the federal government with these treaties, with these tribes, with these locations, with these entrepreneurial activities, and see that it is a complete chaos. It is fragmentation around the country. You really have to be an expert. That's why I said to you at the beginning of this, it's a deep and complex subject because it differs. There's so many different scenarios and situations and laws and inconsistencies, even from the United States Supreme Court. And so it's hard to say that we have done a good job in governing the welfare of our indigenous native people.
Well, we have not done much better in the past, but I think Canada's certainly standing on its head now to do better. Um, and the province that I live in is kind of unique physically. It's kind of like Switzerland, where there's no flat land. You're either in a skinny valley, which usually has a lake and a river in it, or you're on a mountain that's steep enough that you can't grow anything on it. You can't do anything. And the interesting thing is that from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean in Canada is very different from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Ocean in Washington State or Oregon, uh, because there's a series of mountain ranges in say Washington State and Oregon. There is a coast range, but it's not like the coast range as you go north. If you see any of these Alaska cruises, you have the icebergs dropping from a mountain right into the ocean. That is, there is no land between the coast range and the water. And that applies for most of British Columbia. This is the only place where there's, lots of land, is where, there's at the south end where the Alaska Panhandle ends, is right in that area. There's a fair stretch, and then near Vancouver, and the rest is, the mountains are pretty close to the ocean. Well, between the Rocky Mountains and that coast range, there are several north-south running additional mountain ranges, so that there's nothing but these skinny valleys. So when the North American continent was settled, it was very hard to get to British Columbia. That you got to the Rocky Mountains and then everybody just stopped. Where you'd have these things of the Lewis and Clark type of thing. They had some difficulty making it from Montana to Oregon. But if they were another 150 miles north, they'd have never made it. You just, there's about 3 extra mountain ranges in between. And so our native problem developed very differently from the rest of Canada. And that what you had was we had a large native population that was integrated economically fairly well until there was a gold rush. That is immediately following the California gold rush was a gold rush in British Columbia, and then that was followed by the one in the Yukon and Alaska. Well,
Did you know,
just
by the way, that there was a gold rush in Georgia in the 1830s? I bet you didn't know that.
no, I did not know that. But then,
How about that?
of course, I the only education I got in the United States was a university. um, and in Canada, we didn't even learn about the natives.
Right.
uh, however, the British Columbia scenario was very different. That as the before the Oregon Treaty was signed, it was like the United Kingdom dealing in British Columbia. Canada was something Ontario, Quebec, Eastern stuff. And the western part of the U.S. You had Mexico owning, California and Nevada and Arizona type of thing, and immediately north of that was this, funny Oregon territory or whatever you want to call it, and years before, the border between Canada and the U.S. was settled from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains, on the 49th parallel. But there was no border between what's now British Columbia and Washington and all the way down to Mexico. It was who's the United States. They kind of were Oregon territory stuff. Anything north of what the Mexicans owned, the U.S. was involved, but so was the British. Well, in the well into the 1800s until the gold rush, the real activity in British Columbia was there was good business occurring in Vancouver, but the biggest business was the fur trade. And the fur trade related to a network of dealing with all of these Indian tribes that occupied all the valleys in British Columbia, and they, shuffle their furs to the only 2 places you could kind of get to the ocean, and this fur trade was one where the economies of the natives greatly improved. It was very different than, the like Montana or Alberta. The treatment of the natives there, was a different scenario altogether. There was just no connection once the Rocky Mountains just provided a barrier, and that until the gold rush, which we kind of inherited, a slug of the gold rush participants came from California. They were Americans that had their, racial bias built in. and that, when they were looking for gold, they didn't care what native was in that valley, and they created a major mess. But there was enough people that stayed in British Columbia because it is a very nice place to live, much like Washington State. And the end result was the governor of British Columbia back, in the early days, they decided that, the key to the native situation is, those that weren't going to die from the disease like smallpox, we just kind of squish them out and confine them to areas and not enter into any kind of treaty with any of them. And so British Columbia went for a long time without having treaties of any sort. And so, you're sitting where today it's a day and night scenario difference is that British Columbia is loaded with resources, and of course most resources you deal with in the valley. Well, the native population in British Columbia has what are called land claims, and the land claims of the native population are between 2 and 3 times the area of the whole province.
Oh,
Now the
how
province,
can you do that? How can you have
oh well, they
claims that
claim,
exceed?
well,
Okay.
that was because the Canadian court system and politicians kind of softened up to, gee, we've been miserable people, and that isn't Canadians. We're good people. We should be more humane, and so they built in certain laws, and one of them was where there was not a treaty, that the native population had certain rights to their original hunting grounds, wherever they dealt. Well, of course, if you're an Indian band and you're in one little skinny valley, you can say, well, we've got that valley. Well, they claimed, well, we went from the mountaintop on one side to the mountaintop on the other side. But then, of course, there was the odd river or pass in between. Well, of course, we were in the other valley as well. you know, so the tribes on both sides would say they all had rights to the Central
Oh,
Valley.
we haven't mentioned that, and I think it's really important to punctuate what you're saying. Is that the Indians were not monolithic. There were hundreds of tribes, or dozens of them anyway, across the U.S., and they were fighting with each other. The Indian wars were happening constantly through the 19th century, and
Oh, and they
sometimes it
held
was
each
in the.
other as slaves. They held
Uh,
each others as slaves. If one tribe, well, captures others and enslaves
Yeah,
them.
I don't think it's been covered in the popular literature and filmmaking, but the government was rightfully concerned to stop the Indians from fighting with each other, because their whole historical experience, before the white man came, was to have these regular wars. We don't realize that it
Well,
wasn't monolithic.
most of the BC ones did not have wars against each other, much like the ones on the prairies did. Like, you know, I was raised in the city, Calgary, Alberta, and the natives around there fought each other like crazy. But not the ones in British Columbia, and
Interesting,
so
yeah.
yeah, and you ended up where these British Columbia, the courts in Canada have said that the natives had some rights to all of their historical hunting grounds, or wherever they traveled and dealt. What was their original territory? Well, they got some rights. So what happens if you want to build a pipeline from the oil sands in northern Alberta to the coast in British Columbia? You got to go through, while British Columbia has 300 First Nations, that is, entities where the federal government of Canada has said they can call themselves a First Nation and they're entitled to certain amounts of self-government. So let's say Metro Vancouver has 5 levels of government.
Well,
You know,
it seems to me that both governments, U.S. and Canada, they have provided certain benefits, and they've been sympathetic and maybe more or less. But the question is whether they have gone far enough or too far. What do you think about Canada in that regard?
some have gone too far because, for example, uh, uh, in northeast British Columbia, which happens to be east of the Rocky Mountains, because the Rocky Mountains run at an angle, and so um, that portion of British Columbia is the only portion that isn't solid mountains, and it has just a ton of oil and gas, probably the biggest gas field in North America, um, that's not really producing diddly squat in gas. because you can't move it anywhere. We're selling whatever gas the US will take, which the US is then converting into LNG, Canadian gas being exported via the US at a markup, but to get across British Columbia with a pipeline is almost impossible because every one of these 300 First Nations, have certain rights to go to
Mhm.
court and argue and say, well, we're not being compensated, and
That's
gee,
a problem. That's a problem. And you need the federal government to straighten it out because ultimately it's an economic problem.
well, the
But
federal
let me,
government caused it.
yes, I agree. But the modern government has to inherit that. So before we close, I do want to touch on a couple of the tribes that you mentioned in Alaska. American tribes. It's
Inuit.
the Inuit is one, and the Aleuts is the other, from the word Aleutian. Aleutian
Yeah.
chain. They came from the Aleutian chain from Asia. But they do pretty well with the cruise ships now, and the cities in Alaska. They have businesses. They conduct tours. They are an inherent part of tourism, and so it works well for them. And you have to give them credit. And you have to give the hospitality industry, the cruise ship industry, credit for that. And you know who visits them? The native Hawaiians from Hawaii visits them.
Well,
There's
yeah,
a
I
kind
think
of camaraderie.
I think you might be reading some propaganda because the natives that are benefiting from the tourist industry are in the Alaska Panhandle, where Juneau is, and up to where Anchorage is. But if you go anywhere where there are the Inuit, there is no cruise ship going anywhere near there. That's the north slope on the Beaufort Sea where they have all the disputes of, the Caribou Range and they shouldn't have oil up there. Like that dispute. But those Inuit are just sucking air the same as the ones in northern Canada.
Yeah.
The climate change is ruining the foundation upon which their buildings exist. It's ruining their hunting. At least the caribou herds are still in fairly good form.
Let me turn to Hawaii before we close, and that is Hawaii. Hawaii has indigenous people, of course, Native Hawaiians. It's easier to track when they came here because it wasn't that long ago, as opposed to American Indians and Canadian Indians and Indians in Latin America, for that matter, because that was way, way back when. But in Hawaii, it's not the same. People, some people like to treat Native Hawaiians as indigenous people, Indian people, but they're not really grouped with Indian people as far as the reading that I have done. They're a special category, and they have different issues and different expectations and different treatment by the government, and their level of assimilation into the society is different. But I think that's worth mentioning because the origin and the process runs a parallel to what you've been talking about and what I've been talking about.
Well, having visited Hawaii many times, I felt that the bigotry against Native Hawaiians was not much different than the bigotry against anybody else is different than the guy who has the bigotry. That is, bigotry seems to be a built-in human trait, and so any society tends to sort of categorize people. If you you know live in a place where there's multiracial people, there tends to be in everybody's mind a ranking of who's you know the least miserable or who's the best and who's the worst.
That's so true. It's all around the world in inevitable ranking, and it's a troublesome aspect of the human condition. Ken, we're out of time. Ken Rogers, a retired Canadian businessman from Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada, helping us understand not only what happens in Canada, but how that's different from what happens in the US. Thank you so
Did you
much.
did you know Kelowna was an Indian word?
I did know that. I did know that. And everybody listening should make a note that Kelowna is an Indian word. As a matter of fact, if you look across Canada and if you look across the United States, you will find a tremendous number of place names are Indian words. And on that note, we have to go. Thank you, Ken. Aloha.
If you liked this show, why don't you give us a like or subscribe to our channel? Thanks so much.